I will pass now to Dr. Mafalda Mascarenhas Garcia, who will speak about the licensing principle and outsourcing in the financial sector. Dr. Mafalda Mascarenhas Garcia is head of the legal department of IBM in Portugal and specialized in cybersecurity investigations and strategy. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for staying. Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm conscious of the fact that I'm the only thing stopping you from having lunch, so I'll promise that I'll be very fast at the speed of digital transformation and technology innovation. So, as a way of introduction and context, in the recent years we have seen the increasing need of the financial sector to use outsourcing. 10 years ago, it was there was a boom in particular in banks to outsource their infrastructure maintenance. But now I think there is not an area of the financial sector which is able to be immune to outsourcing. Speaking of outsourcing arrangements, I'm going to focus, because it's a very broad concept, so I'm going to focus specifically on technology. I'm working for a technology company, and digital transformation. And so the rapid digitalization of the financial service sector added more complexity to the game, to a game which was already very complex, and obviously raised the attention of the financial services regulators. So who are the key players in terms of outsourcing and this ecosystem environment that exists around outsourcing in particular to the financial sectors? We have the cloud service providers, and you probably know the AWS for Amazon, and Azure, which is for Microsoft, Google Cloud, IBM Cloud, of course, Oracle, SAP. Then you have the system integrators. System integrators are typically a consulting company that go and collect, in order to build a solution, they collect products from different entities, in particular technology providers, like Cisco, IBM, Microsoft. And then we have these two general and broad concepts of fintechs. We know that fintechs, there is approximately, I think, 25,000 fintechs around the world. In Europe, there are around 7,000 fintechs. What is interesting to observe is the shift that we had 3 to 4 years ago, where banks didn't like very much fintechs and they look at them as competition. And what we are seeing today is a significant shift in that reality, not only because fintechs help banks to solve pain points, things that they usually don't address, but also because they are a driver of innovation. And then obviously we have the non-fintech players, which both the banking sector and fintechs need to watch, because they are a significant competitor in the field, and because they have different offerings to customers which represent a heavy competition to banks and to fintechs. So very briefly, what are the market trends? We are seeing fast innovation driving growth. So new business models, the use of fourth parties, so the entire supply chain is growing and is driving this innovation growth and presenting new revenue streams. So if banks want to keep in the race, they really need to use outsourcers if they want to deliver speed, innovation, and if they want to keep the pace of the market disruption. And then cloud. I'm going to briefly talk about cloud. So the same. It's taking time for the financial sector to integrate cloud, but it's something that steadily and slowly we are seeing. So I guess like 20% of companies have adhered to cloud. There is a lot of market, 80% will still need to adhere. And in the financial sector, what we're seeing is banking sector and financial sector, they didn't feel the trust and the confidence to migrate, in particular critical functions into cloud. But now slowly what we are seeing, in particular because of the competition of fintechs and other big techs, is that they're migrating more and more because it's much more agile, and they know that it's inevitable and it's an integral part of the digital transformation of banks. So as an impact of this innovation and on cloud, we know that banks need to be future ready. They need to invest in technology, and obviously because of the offerings and of the skills, there is a higher appetite for outsourcing. Key challenges that the financial sector and in particular banks are facing. Obviously, they need to manage the ever-increasing complex environment. So the fact that they need to rely on supply chain means that they are much more exposed to risk, which they need to consider. And obviously, they cannot turn into the regulator and say, oh, this is the vendor's responsibility, they did it. So they cannot do that. They need to control the entire supply chain. What we're also seeing is an increasingly cost of compliance, so associated compliance obligations. They need to increase their regulatory departments to control all the regulations, all the legislation that goes around with different perspectives. Another challenge is that there are not enough people, not enough skills. There is a shortage of skills, and also that's one of the reasons why they need to outsource, because there is lack of skills. And digital technology and innovation now has a totally different perspective because the entire entity needs to be involved. To give you an example, usually when you call the bank, if you want to call the bank, you will, the person that will answer the phone will be a chatbot with a voice very similar to a human being. You probably won't even know that you're talking to a robot. And it's completely unacceptable in terms of client treatment. It's totally unacceptable that the bot doesn't have an entire profile of the client when speaking with a client. So if I'm dealing with a very unhappy client, I probably shouldn't be trying to selling certain products. So there's a strategic alignment and mindset which now it's more along the entire entity. Another of the challenges that we're facing, and I think it was evidence from the presentations that were here this morning, is the regulatory uncertainty. Because obviously it's very difficult for legislation to keep the pace of innovation, but there is a huge unsync between innovation and legislation, and so this uncertainty also represents a risk. This uncertainty also is sometimes what's preventing banks to jump into innovation, like in cloud, because they're afraid of the risks, of the uncertainties, of the penalties from the regulators. But then with the pandemic, innovation and digital transformation became absolutely inevitable, and the banks know that. And also there is a strong competition from players in the market. And then there is the customer itself. The customer wants instant gratification, and they treat banks and financial institutions as if they were booking a holiday or if they were ordering food. And so the scenario completely changed, and banks need to keep the pace. So the relationship between banks and new players, as I said at the beginning, or some years ago, banks looked at competition, and in particular fintechs, as a threat. That is not the case anymore. So there is this co-opetition and some collaboration with fintechs. Of course, the fact that these new players need to comply with data protection, privacy security, cybersecurity, and the compliance parameters, that should be a concern, in particular if banks are using these entities and fintechs as outsourcers, as subcontractors of their services. What we're seeing, and it was discussed before, is in fintechs, they can solve specific pain points, because usually they are small in size, but also because it's a very interesting product, but the market is small, and so it's something to be dealt with by a fintech, or it is too risky, and so let's see if the fintech goes there first, and then the banks, maybe, if it's interesting, jump in. So they need to pay attention to whatever is happening. A huge threat to both fintechs and banks are obviously the big techs. They are clearly disintermediating the banks from their clients and offering products which is difficult for banks to offer at such pace. Let's give the example of Tesla offering insurances, or Amazon offering buy now and pay later. So this messy slide is on purpose. Where we are in terms of regulation, we have so many different regulations and different regulators and different focus that financial institutions have to consider. That there is a kind of unfragmented legislation, and so there are different approaches. We see risk management and financial stability. The European supervisory authorities issue guidelines, which sometimes are more broad than others. Sometimes they just address cloud service providers. Then there is the operation resilience, more on a vertical level of regulation. We have cyber resilience. I'm not going to address cybersecurity, which is actually a topic I like very much. Not addressing this today, but obviously represents a huge risk and huge investment. So we are seeing a growth in investment in security, and probably a need to look at it in a regulatory perspective. And then a new approach, which is a sovereignty. And so it's the policy agenda and this unfragmented legislation and regulatory and different perspectives, it makes it very, very difficult to cope operationally. And so this is something that needs to be addressed by the regulators, and I'm sure that they are trying to address that. And one of the examples is DORA, the Digital Operation Resilience Act, which is not enforced. But the perspective here is, from an operational resilience perspective, is how can I look at the big picture in terms of resilience? Obviously, the regulator wants to extend the regulation perimeter. It's not clear, for instance, if a company like IBM will be covered by this regulation. It's something that we need to see. So clearly, the regulator is trying to balance this gap between the fast pace of digital transformation and innovation and technology, and obviously the need to regulate whatever is out there, which is always be very difficult and a very difficult exercise. So in terms of licensing, and that we discussed this here today, I think there is we come to the conclusion that policymakers and regulators and supervisors, they really need to dialogue. There must be a way of dialoguing, Because then each of them will give a different approach, will issue a different regulation, and then it's very hard for the entities in the market to keep pace of it. And one of the things that they probably need to do is to embrace technology themselves, which is not something that we're seeing. They need to embrace it, they need to live it, they need to feel it. Otherwise, there will always be a distance between what exists and what doesn't exist. And so what we need to be careful is if we keep the dialogue, and because digital transformation is much faster than the capacity of the regulators to legislate, is that we also, it's very dangerous to give space to new players in the market to escape regulation, because the same way as lawyers are very proficient at finding loopholes in the law, obviously creative people in technology, they are very advanced, and so it's very, very easy to escape the regulator arm. So I finish with the future of technology, what we're facing very quickly. Obviously, artificial intelligence and machine learning are already in a relatively mature stage. Then obviously we are seeing the migration into cloud and APIs. Cybersecurity is a huge concern, and this is inverting the banking model. My last comment is about quantum computing. The evolution of quantum computing is surprisingly faster than expected. It's not as mature as artificial intelligence, but this will raise and will bring much more problems to the table that we have today. One of them, which is already being addressed, for instance, in the US, is encryption. So traditional computers and for instance, even artificial intelligence, in order to find out the password, you need to look into each and every combination of possible combination, and depending on the password, it can take years to encrypt. And the thing is with quantum computing, because the way they build the algorithms and the way the entanglement works, it means that quantum computing, they can look at the various possibilities, all of them at the same time, which means that it will take hours for something which today takes years. And so encryption and the fact that probably the information will be revealed to the world once the quantum computing is mature and is working in the market is one of the things that we need to look at in the future. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Mafalda.